Hello, welcome. You're all here to hear about threat modeling, correct? Yes? Good. All right. Let me ask you a couple of questions just to see kind of what you know already, if that's okay. So who here practices digital security in some way? Okay. Who here is here because they want to learn? Yeah? Who here is here for some other reason? No? Okay, great. So what I'm going to talk about is the thing that I talk about first. Whenever I give a training or a talk about how to stay safe online, this to me is the very basis of all of it. You start here, and then you go to somebody who's more expert than me, and you learn how to use the tools. The reason for that, in my experience over the years, and I will say first, I'm not a technologist, and I'm not an expert on this topic. So I hope that's okay. What I am is I'm a practitioner. I'm someone who uses these tools. I'm someone who feels that it's important for me, for my needs, and for my network to stay safe online. And I'm someone who has been training for about 3 years on these topics. So I'm not an expert, but I'm not a beginner either. So the reason that we're going to talk about threat modeling, and I'll explain what that is in a second, is because if you start out of fear, or if you start because someone said, here, use this tool, it works, not only does it not help you to understand the foundations of why this is important and who you're trying to protect yourself from, but it can also be dangerous. If you're just handed a tool and someone says, use this, and they teach you how to use it, but they don't explain why or with whom, then you could actually be in a worse position than you were when you started. Because we do have good instincts. Okay, so threat modeling, what does it mean? Well, it's kind of just a silly technical security term that is really just talking about a few things, and I'm going to introduce this by going through a series of questions, and then we're going to play a little bit and talk and make this a little more interactive. So the first thing that I would ask you is, who are you? Who are you and what do you do? So raise your hand if you're a journalist. Or work in journalism in some way, even if you don't write. Editors, copy editors, okay. So we've got a lot of journalists in the room. I'll ask for more examples after this. Okay, so if you're a journalist, who am I? I'm a journalist. Now, what am I trying to protect? Well, if you're a journalist, I'm guessing that there are probably quite a few things that you need to protect. But a big one, can anyone name what the big one is? Sources, of course. So if you're a journalist, or maybe even if you're an activist or in other fields, you have people who are vulnerable that you need to communicate with. And you need to protect those people. Now you may also have things that you want to protect, like the drive that you keep photographs on, or where you keep your files. But in this case, we're just going to use sources as the example. Okay, so we know who you are, we know what you want to protect. The next question that I would ask you is, who do you want to protect it from? Now, you might not always know the answer to that, and that's okay. But let's just go through a couple of examples. So is anyone a foreign correspondent? Do we have any foreign correspondents? Anyone who travels to kind of dangerous countries? No? Okay, well, let's go with your own government then. Let's go with Italy, why not? I don't know much about it. So hope nobody's, Okay, so let's say that you're an Italian journalist and you work in Italy and you're worried about your government. Okay, and you're worried because you're trying to protect sources. Now we've got a bigger picture of what we're looking at. Who are you? What do you want to protect? Who do you want to protect it from? The next thing I would ask is, how much effort are you willing to put in to protect it? And that's really important because even if you have all of the spirit about it in the world, all of the passion, if you're not willing to put in the effort to go far to protect something, then you have other choices. There are other behavioral choices that you can make. It's not always about one answer. There are different choices that you can make in understanding how to protect a certain thing. Okay, so we've gone through all of those. I won't summarize them until the end. And then the last question I would ask is, what's the likelihood that you're going to need to protect this thing? And that's also an important question. Has anyone heard the term privacy hipster? Okay, so a privacy hipster, in my parlance, in my opinion, is someone who follows all the latest hip tools and tries to use all of them at the same time, but probably doesn't really know why they're doing it. So this is the person who's like, hey, have you heard about PGP? I'm using PGP. It's really important. But then when you ask them to explain what it is or even what it stands for, blank. Don't be the privacy hipster. Instead, we want to think realistically about our threats, and we don't want to scare people or get scared. That's not useful, and it's not going to help you keep anyone safe. Instead, you want to think realistically. So can I get a volunteer? Is anybody? You don't have to stand up. You can stay where you are, but volunteer? Oh, okay, no one's raising their hand, so I'm going to pick her. Hi, Farah. Will you volunteer? So Farah, what do you do? Okay, press freedom and media development. Okay, sorry, I thought there was a window. Press freedom and media development. That's just me. Okay, press freedom media development. Got it. And what are you trying to protect? Okay, so journalists that she communicates with, they live in dangerous places. Like where, for example? Syria. Okay, that's a serious one. Oh, that was not a pun. Okay, so Syrian journalists or Syrian sources, dangerous areas. That makes sense. And what was the third question? Thank you. Oh, listen to that. Trying to do them in the same order that I told you. So you're trying, in that case, it's pretty clear. Probably the Syrian government, maybe ISIS or Daesh. Your own government, okay. All right, so in that case, she's looking at a number of different threats, and that's an interesting scenario, so we'll stick with it. And then, how much effort are you willing to put in? Significant amount, okay. And then the likelihood, I think in this case, it's probably pretty strong, but again, that question can be hard because it's not always easy to determine the likelihood of which you're going to be hacked or you're going to have a government surveilling you. Instead, you kind of just have to weigh that as best you can, the same way that you would make decisions about how much money to carry on you in a certain neighborhood at night, right? So it's similar to just keeping yourself safe on a normal basis. Okay. So the reason that I asked her all of those questions and that we went through these examples is when I do a security training, this is how I start, because it's almost like, I don't like this example, but it works sometimes, bear with me. It's almost like being a doctor and trying to diagnose your patient. You have to ask them questions about what they're feeling, what they're thinking, how they consider the environment around them, what their lifestyle is like, and make a diagnosis or a prescription based on that. And the prescription, I think, is the interesting part, because when we talk about all of these different tools, and if you're here to learn about security, I'm guessing that you're going to other talks as well, where you're going to actually learn some hands-on things. When we're talking about all of these tools, I consider them to be kind of like a prescription. In her case, for example, knowing what I know about the scenario that she just gave me, I might, for example, I'm not saying this is necessarily the right answer, but I might recommend that she take some serious precautions, that she use Tor, for example, or install PGP and use that regularly with the people that she communicates with, for example. But that would be the prescription that I would give to her for her scenario, and we would talk about other things such as behavioral changes in how she uses social media, for example, who she adds as friends, or whether she uses Twitter DM to communicate with someone versus a more secure platform. And then we might also talk a little bit about physical safety, because sometimes people forget when they're talking about digital security that the least safe thing could be the person standing behind you. So we would kind of talk about all of these different scenarios, make a prescription, diagnose her, and then move on from there. Now, does this all make sense so far? Any questions up to this point? No? Okay, cool. Well, then I'm done. The talk's over. No, I'm just kidding. So I think at that point, what I would start to do is, once I've given her that diagnosis, given her a prescription, given her some of these tools to work with, then I think that the next key thing to remember is that it doesn't happen in one day. So I think this is also maybe a little bit of that privacy hipster mentality, the idea that, okay, now I know all of this stuff, I'm following the Snowden thing, I know what's up, I know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm doing. I've been doing this I've been using most of these tools that I've mentioned for 5, 6, 7 years. I've been training for 3 years, and there are a lot of things that I still absolutely don't understand at all. And I think that that's okay, and that's something that if you ever have a trainer tell you you have to do something right now and have to learn it today, leave the room and go somewhere else. Because honestly, this is something that I think takes a lot of time. Now, would another example help? Do you want to go through another scenario? Do I have another volunteer? Someone very different. Give me a, come on. All right. Hi. Who are you? What do you do? Ah, okay, a software developer, excellent. And what are you trying to protect?
My life.
Your life. Yeah. Whew, whew, that's heavy. Okay, you're trying to protect your life, and who are you trying to protect it from?
I guess the company that want to copy my life to give me advertising.
Ah, interesting. Okay, all right. So you're protecting personal data in this case. Ah, good one. Okay. And how much effort are you willing to put in?
Very few.
Very few. Okay, not a lot of effort. Protecting your life with very little effort. That's going to work out really well for you, Claudio.
I'm optimistic.
And then the last question was, what's the likelihood that you're going to need to protect yourself against this threat? Yeah, this is true. So does everyone understand the example that we're talking about? So you all use social media, Google. Anybody who doesn't use Google at all? Wow, impressive. All right. But most of us have a hard time avoiding Google. I think that's fair. However, there are ways that you can get around this. I'm just going to use a few examples of how I would talk through this one. So, okay, so Claudio tells me that he's a software developer. That's true. And that he wants to protect his personal data against all of these big companies. So how would you think about that? I'm gonna use you guys now to help me with these answers. Help me make some prescriptions. We're all doctors. We're not all doctors. I'm not a doctor. So, okay, so he's trying to protect his personal data from a company. And he's not willing to put in a lot of effort. Does anyone have a sense of how you might advise him? What? Go offline. Okay, that's one choice. Fair enough, although I'm guessing for him that would be a lot of effort. What else? What other options might you give him? Is everybody tired? Okay, so I might say that there are some very easy tools that he could use. He might be able to use an ad blocking tool, for example, or Privacy Badger, which my organization puts out, full disclosure. Or he could use Google in incognito mode. Very simple, very low effort that would give him a little bit of benefit. Or he could go a little bit farther and use Tor. He could use a different I almost said a different Google, a different search engine. That's terrible, just shoot me now. He could use a different search engine like Startpage or DuckDuckGo. So there are little choices that we can all make in our everyday lives. I think that's kind of the point that I'm trying to make here. I mean, I think that looking at the threat holistically and understanding really where you are and what your real threats are is much better than just trying to dive in, because I think that can be very overwhelming. So let me talk about a few different examples of what a threat could look like, because so far we've talked about companies, we've talked about the really scary governments, the Syrian government, the Egyptian government, but what about just your average everyday threat? What's somebody else that you might want to protect yourself from? Okay, well, oh, sorry?
Advertising companies?
Advertising companies?
Kids from their parents having private personal conversations.
Yes, that's what I was gonna say. Remember when you were a teenager? Yeah, there's that too. Although if anyone has kids, I'm not gonna try to influence them in any direction. So there's that. There's trying to protect yourself from people around you, physically around you, your family maybe members of your community if you live somewhere that is not, maybe it's more conservative than you are, or something like that. advertisers. Who else? Lawyer? Oh, employer. Yeah, that's a big one. Your employer. Okay. Try not to do anything illegal at work, but yeah, your employer. Anyone else? Your average everyday hacker who's trying to get your banking information? Okay. So there are a lot of different examples here. And I think that's helpful in trying to understand where we go with the diagnosis. Because the one-size-fits-all approach to this isn't going to, giving the same answer that you would give for trying to protect yourself from the Syrian government to someone who's just trying to protect themselves from their employer probably isn't very helpful. I mean, can you imagine? You're trying to protect yourself from your employer, so you go, okay, I'm going to take a digital security training, and you go, and they start by telling you that the first thing you should do is install PGP. You're like, that's not really going to help you with your employer. Instead, the solutions for your employer are probably a little bit more simple than that. Maybe a VPN, maybe a separate device, maybe using Tor at work if you can. Little options that will help you go pretty far with that, but certainly not as intense as when you're trying to protect yourself from a government. So I'm going to take a moment to have a sip of water and check my notes again. And let me ask you, does anyone have any questions at this point? No questions. Well, I'm still going to have the sip of water, so think. All right. So, what else do you want to know? I can keep going, but I like to check in. What else do you want to know at this point? They gave me an hour for something that's normally about 30 minutes. All right, cool. So, let's think about this in our real lives. Let me give you this so that you can take this and move forward and share. So this is what I do. I go through those questions. If I was giving a training to a group of this size, I would probably make you speak up a little bit more, but I would still do it exactly as I just did. But what I would do and send people home to do is actually go home and make a list of all of these things. You all know who you are. You know what you do for a living. But I would actually sit there and make a list of all of the different possible things that I want to keep safe. So let's try that out a little bit. So we've talked about a couple things. We've talked about sources mostly and our personal data. But what else, what other scenarios can you think of other things, digital or not, that you need to keep safe?
A lot of us use mobile, so plugins, browsers, a lot of it is resource intense and is on your desktop. So what are the options to use plugins or tools on your tablet or your phone? That will not kind of reduce you to a crawl.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a great example. So your mobile phone. Mobiles are a little scary because they have tracking devices in them that can follow you everywhere that you go. And so that is really important to think about not just the ways that you use your laptop, which can be much safer, especially if it's offline, but your mobile phone, which has a lot of ways in which you can be monitored if you're not careful. So yeah, that's a great one. What else? Documents. Yeah, physical or digital. I still don't know what to do with the physical ones. I wish I had a good solution. If anyone else does, let me know. What else? Nothing? Nothing else? Yes.
How safe are, how safe are cloud services that I use to sync maybe desktop, tablet, and mobile phone? Is there a way to secure upload and download into my own cloud?
That's a great question. I'm going to put that one on hold for just a minute and try to come back to it. So, okay, so we've got a bunch of different things that you want to keep safe. Now, let's say that's your list, the things we just thought of. We've got your personal data, your sources, your mobile phone, all the things you do with it, and your documents. That's kind of a range of different things that you need to keep safe. And so, as you might imagine, that has a range of different solutions on how you might want to go about that. And so the effort question, let's just assume that we're going to put in a reasonably good amount of effort into protecting all of these things. Now, what would you do next? How would you go about trying to, map those different things and find a solution to, with even, let's say you don't know any of the tools at all. You don't know what they're called, you don't know how to use them, but what you know is that you need to keep those things safe. What would be the logical next step in trying to figure out how to do that? Any thoughts? Yeah?
Maybe create a diagram, what I do, a kind of mind map of tools and maybe my behavioral pattern.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Behavior is an important part of this too. That's what I would actually do, something very similar to that. I would probably draw those different things, figure out how they're similar. So if I had, for example, both documents and photographs, probably going to be a similar solution for protecting those things. And so I would map those different things out, and even if I didn't know the tools at all, I would start to figure it out that way. So, okay, so if we're talking about documents or photographs, let's say assume that they're digital. The first thing that I would think is, okay, how do I need to protect these? Is it, I mean, assuming that I'm protecting them from all of the above, all of the different adversaries or threats that we talked about, if I were going to try to protect those things, I would probably know inherently that there are a few different places that I can store them. So where would where do you store your documents? Hard drive? Cloud? Where else? Pen drive? Okay, that's pretty much the main three, right? Okay, and then is that device online or offline? I would think about that, offline. Better, yeah, it's better offline, but again, we may not want to go the whole way. So if we're going to go a little bit of the way, what are the things that we need to think about? And that's where I would start to kind of map that out. Okay, so I keep them in a drive that's offline. Well, then if you already know that you're keeping those things in a drive that you have offline, then the really important thing is probably where you store that drive, right? Or how you store that drive. Is it encrypted, for example? Even if it's not, is it locked in a safe or is it sitting on your bed in a hotel room? Okay, same goes for when you're thinking about sources. You want to protect your sources and you know that they're at risk. What would you start to think about? How do you communicate with them? So how are you communicating with your sources already? Anyone want to share? What do you use to talk with your sources as a journalist? We've got a pitch for global leaks, fair enough. What else do you use? Email? Phone? Okay. Email, phone, maybe some, what? Physical meeting, yeah. Still have to worry about that one though. Okay, so if you're thinking about email and phone, then what would you start to think about after that? I'm trying to just walk you through the logical steps of this. So you communicate with your sources via email and phone, maybe the occasional in-person meeting, but that still has to be arranged somehow. So you start to think, okay, my phone. Now, if it's a mobile phone, then we know from what we've talked about already that these are kind of inherently unsafe. And I don't want to say that in a scary way. I don't want to scare you from carrying a phone, because I still carry mine all the time. But it's still a thing to think about. This is probably the least secure way that you can contact a source, depending, again, on your threat. Now, if it's email, email is something also to think about that comes in different layers of security. So I know we'll probably have some hardcore security people in the room who always use PGP, and that's okay. But I'm not really of the opinion that that's something you have to push on people. I think it's a good idea for people who work in dangerous places, definitely. But scaring people into thinking that's their only option doesn't make them safer. Instead, you might want to think about, okay, so we were talking about her example earlier. You live in Egypt, right? She lives in Egypt, and the chance of the NSA sharing information with the Egyptian government is probably fairly low. I'm glad, I thought it was higher, but anyway. So in that case, for her, Gmail might be a fairly good solution, because Gmail does use pretty good security, but the provider itself has access to your information. So that's a threat to you if your adversary or your threat is an advertiser, then Gmail's a bad choice. If you're worried about advertisers, terrible choice. If you're worried about the Egyptian government, probably an okay choice. And that's something to remember too, that it's not always, you don't always have to go as far. But say you want to. Say, you do think that that's a big threat, or we're talking about, another government or whatever. Then, maybe we do want to take a step further and try using PGP. Are people familiar with that, or am I just repeating an acronym that nobody knows? PGP? Okay. Would anyone like me to explain it? Yes? Oh, crap. Okay, I've got to explain PGP. All right. So PGP stands for Pretty Good Privacy, and it is a protocol that allows email to be end-to-end encrypted. Now, let me try to explain end-to-end encryption. This is always a fun one. I need my hands for this. Okay. And if there are people who are really good at explaining this and they don't like my explanation, then I'm going to invite them up here to explain it for me. So here's how I think about PGP. It's an email, or an email protocol, that when I send a message to you, I lock that message, and when you receive that message on the other end, you unlock it. That's the really simple way of thinking about this. Now, if you want to go one step further in understanding it, it's actually asymmetric encryption, which means that the key that I use to lock the email is different than the key that you use to unlock the email. That's really kind of hard to think about in a physical concept. I like to think of it as like a box that I give you as a gift. I lock it, there's something very special in it, and I give it to you, and I give you the key to open it, but even my key won't open it, only yours will. I don't think that box exists, though, so makes it a little bit hard. I mean, actually, maybe like safety deposit boxes or something, but anyway, I hope that kind of gives you an idea of what it is. Basically, the idea is that only I can lock it and only you can unlock it. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's probably the most secure you can get when you're talking about email, and it's certainly a good idea. I'm not going to discourage people from using it, but there are disagreements as to whether it's the best choice or not, and most of those have to do not with its safety, but with the likelihood of its failure, the likelihood that a person who's not good at using it will make a mistake, which I've done more than once. Okay, so that's one. So we talked about that. And then let me go back a step. Sources, email, phones, right. Okay, so let's say we're talking about how to keep yourself or your source safe on the telephone. That's a tough one, and it doesn't have easy answers. And so if we're gonna think through it logically, do the threat modeling exercise, then what we wanna think about is both people's phones, how those phones are secured. So do you have, I'm going to start with the simple things. Do you have location services turned on? You know how you can turn that on and off? Okay, so that's an important thing to think about because that actually helps with your tracking. It's much easier to track you when that's on. You might also think about things of whether or not your phone call could be intercepted. There are free apps. There's a free app called Signal or Red Phone, I think, still, if you're on Android, right? Yeah. So Signal if you're on iPhone or Red Phone if you're on Android, that make your phone call end-to-end encrypted. So just like PGP, it encrypts your phone call. Now, it's a little bit easier than PGP, for sure. It involves a passphrase and really simple stuff. I don't normally say this phrase, but it was so easy that my parents could use it, and they do. Yeah, so that's another thing that you might consider if you're talking to sources. Now, what were some of the other things? We talked about documents, and we talked about contacting sources. Were there other examples that people had?
Passwords or passphrases.
Ooh, yeah. Okay, so that's a really easy one. I would say that your information is about only as secure as your passwords are. It's the unfortunate truth. So when we're talking about email or we're talking about keeping documents safe, assuming that you have them password protected, or your device itself, it's true. The password is often the weakest link. You could be doing everything else right, but if your password is terrible, then it's pretty easy to get into your stuff. And that could be, that could be police, it could be a common hacker, it could be anybody. Whoever wants to get in there, they can get in there if they know what they're doing. So that's another thing to think about. And there was one other thing that we talked about people wanting to keep safe. Documents, sources, Your personal data from advertisers. But I think we did go through that one a little bit. I think I've exhausted all of the examples. Do we have any questions at this point? All right. I'm just going to take a slow, deep breath and check my notes one more time. Yeah, question. Great.
Okay, so all these things are things that I can do, but what if I'm communicating with someone and they don't have the technological capacity to install PGP or to understand how to use Redphone or whatever? Is there anything I can do that works from my side?
That's a really, really good question, actually. So I would say that most of the tools that you'll hear about, and again, I'm assuming that most of you are going to be going to more trainings. So most of the things that we're talking about require both people to use them, which can make it really hard, because that means that even if you are willing to go 120% in all of your efforts, if the other person's not, then it's really hard to then communicate with them safely. Sometimes it's not about their effort at all. Sometimes it's about their skills. And I think that that's important to think about too. So I've had this situation before, communicating with people in Syria, just same example as you gave earlier, actually. And it wasn't so much that they didn't have the skills or the effort. It was the amount of time that they were able to get online and the download speed of the tools. It's something really simple, but something that also seems to happen every time I give a training where the internet goes down and then nobody can download the tools. Common problem. So in that case, is there anything that you can do? Well, I think the first thing is behavioral changes. There's not much that you can do on your side to make sure that they are staying safe, but there are things that you can help them do. So that's what I think is good about this set of questions, is walking people through that will just, you can sometimes, I didn't really see it in this room, but I think you guys are both more skilled and maybe a little tired, but often, I'll be giving a training to total beginners, and I walk them through that set of questions, and you can kind of see the wheels turning. People are going like, oh, right, I have this thing. And so in that case, it is behavioral. I'll give you an example from one time when that happened, where I was very pleased. I was giving a training to journalists in the West Bank, Palestine. And there was one journalist who, when I asked her the set of questions, she said that she was a photojournalist, and that the biggest thing for her was protecting both her camera from police. And in her case, it was like not just police, but these police and those police and this other adversary and all of these different threats, because it's a very complicated environment. And it was keeping her camera safe and keeping the
SD card.
SD card, thank you, that she keeps all of her photos on safe. And so we walked through that, and you could kind of watch her going like, oh, right. That it was more about, she knew all of this inherently. She knew instinctively that she had to physically protect her camera from the police and that she had to hide the SD card. But when we started talking about her different options and the different ways that she might protect herself, a lot of it was behavioral, but some of it were things like not really thinking about the fact that if she bought a new camera, for example, that she could buy one that uploads photos to the cloud automatically. Because she's not worried about the government intercepting her stuff digitally. She's worried about them physically seizing her equipment. And so in her case, she was able to make some changes to how she operates as a journalist, and that allowed her to keep things a little bit safer. And so I think that if you are in that scenario where you have someone on the other end who's unable or unwilling to, usually unable, not unwilling. Unwilling, there's not much you can do. But if they're unable to go that extra step for whatever reason, then try to help them walk through these and think about behavioral changes that they can make. It might just mean, looking over their shoulder a little bit more. It might mean using the incognito browser instead of the regular one. Little tiny changes, but some of these things can make a big difference.
What if all my sources or all my friends or my colleagues are on some kind of unsafe social media, and I have to speak with them and I cannot convince them all to change their behavior, and so I'm start having lost.
Are you suggesting?
But what I can do?
Okay, so
besides change friend.
Do you want to give me an example of what? Do you want to give me an example of what this unsafe social media might be?
Facebook.
Facebook. Okay.
Depends from whom. That is the point. Depends from whom. Depends what I consider unsafe. Depends from whom. Maybe from a US person,
Right.
Facebook is a little more safe than from a foreign. But just figure some place where your data can go public by mistake of the person outside of yourself, and they don't want to change their behavior.
Okay, well, I'm Claudio's friend, and I use Facebook, so I'm taking this one a little bit personally, but that will also help me answer the question a little bit better. Okay, so let's say so Facebook, who uses Facebook? Most of you. Okay, congratulations to those who are able to get off the crack. I can't do it, I'm addicted. So, Facebook, now why is Facebook unsafe? Now, this is important. Facebook is not necessarily digitally unsafe. It uses fairly good security measures on the back end. I know the security team, they're doing a pretty good job, but that's not the problem. The problem isn't their level of security or how they store your data necessarily. The problem is two things. One is what you mentioned, the ability to accidentally make something public that shouldn't be public, or to have a photograph with somebody in the background who might get in trouble for that. The other thing is your network. Your network is very easily exposed through Facebook. So I've had friends who, this really happened once. I've had people friends who've said, I'm gonna unfriend you on Facebook because you're friends with some people who are a little too radical, and I'm worried about being associated with those people. But I get what they're saying. They actually kind of have a point, because it could be a risk to them if they were, if somebody has a certain kind of job or whatever. This actually came up a couple of years ago when one of my friends who works for a government also didn't want to be friends with me because she was worried that would get her in trouble with her job. But nevertheless, these are real problems, or, well, privileged problems anyway. And so in that case, what do? You can't convince your friends to leave Facebook, or I'm guessing you've already tried and failed. Okay, so let's assume you've already tried to get them to leave. You've told them all of these things. You've told them all of the threats, and they still won't leave. Is there any way that they can mitigate their risk on Facebook? I'm gonna say yes to that. And I'm not saying that this is the perfect solution, and I'm certainly not endorsing Facebook. But if you are going to be on Facebook, then there are ways that you can make your information a lot more private. And as a company, they've actually tried and done a fairly good job of helping users understand those different techniques that you can use. So if you actually click on Facebook, in the top right corner when you're logged in, there's a little thing that says, "Who can see my stuff?" And it walks you through what they call a privacy checkup. Now, again, I think this is imperfect, but it is one good way to kind of walk through the same kind of questions that we just walked through and think about the different ways that you might be accidentally exposing your information to people. Now, I've done this a couple times, and I was actually surprised in a couple cases. One was that some of my old photo albums were still public when I didn't want them to be. And another one was that there was some bug that was making my new posts be public when I didn't want them to be. And so walking through that helped me to see it, and it was kind of the same thing that we just did. It was a little diagnosis of what I was doing wrong, or maybe in one case what the company was doing wrong. And so I think that that's one thing that you can do. You could also just scare them, but it might not work. Oh, no. I thought you might have a question. No, it's okay. Does anyone else have a question? Yeah.
Oh. Thank you. To protect our data. But what if I intercept an email from PGP, I destroy the email, I send another email with my PGP to you, for example, with your public key, and you are going to open my email and not the original email.
I'm not sure I understand.
Okay, if there are, your friend sent to you an email with PGP. Mm-hmm. I intercept the email, I destroy the email, and I send you an email with your public key, and I pretend to be your friend.
Using their key?
using your key, your public key.
Right, but what key are you using to send the email? Because you said you're intercepting it and you're sending it to me. What key are
Yeah.
you using?
Your public key. No?
This might be too advanced of a question for me to answer. Or I don't understand the question. Yeah, if you'd like to answer it, please. I don't want to get this one wrong. Okay.
Microphone. Yes, for knowing the person that is sending the email, you have to sign the email with your private key. Private key, yes. So checking the private key, checking the signature that is coming from, you can know who is sending the email. But, okay?
Okay, yeah, let me explain that a little bit. I'm going to go back a step. I'm going to go back a step and just kind of explain what the question was and why that's important. I'm not going to actually explain how to do anything, but just to give you a sense of what this means. So remember that whole lock the email with one key, unlock it with the other? So the key that I have, that's my public key, this is what's used to identify me. This is definitely a little complicated, so I apologize for those who are not interested, but hopefully. So I have a public key that identifies me. I also have a private key. Those keys are paired together. It's important. They're together. You register for them at the same time. They work together. Now, when I send an email to you I lock it with my private key, and you identify me. The other important part about this is not just that you use the lock, but that you also verify that the key belongs to the person who says it does. So if I'm using PGP with you, then it's really important that I not only lock the email, but that I also check in with you and look at the signature of your key and identify you for who you are. And there are different ways you can do that, but the best way is probably in person. It's not always possible, but it's a good way to do it. Does this mean, hi? All right. I think we've got about 10 more minutes, and I'm out of new information. Is there any more questions, or would you like to end early? We've got choices. Any more questions?
Suppose to be in a state like Russia and to speak about some kind of debate team like LGBT, and you want to get an audience, keep your flow of news or stuff going, but keep yourself protected. Besides, choose a proper platform that can be like a Blogspot, following the same example you make it before about Google from Egypt. What I can do, because in that way I don't want to hide. I want to be visible, not. I want to be visible, but I want to be protected in some way.
Do you want to use your real name or no?
What do you suggest? I guess no.
Okay, this is a great question. So this is another scenario like we went through before. So the example here is you're Russian and you're writing about LGBT rights, which is a huge no-no there, illegal at the moment to talk about some of these things, to advocate for them. And so that's who you are. You're Russian, you're writing about this, and your threat is pretty clear. It's the government, it's the Russian state. You may have other threats as well, they might be personal, but that's the big one. And let's say, you can't really decide, do I want to put my name out there or do I want to stay anonymous? So if that's the scenario that we're thinking about, then I would go through the same set of questions. I would think about how likely is the threat, and I think that that's an important one there, because the likelihood of the threat to you, if you're writing about that, changes. It changes whether you're anonymous or not anonymous, or pseudonymous, using a pseudonym. It changes if you're famous or high profile versus not, and not always in the way that you would think. Sometimes high profile people are at less risk than low profile people because arresting them is more likely to create a news storm. So you would think about those types of things. You might think about the way that you're writing about it. Are you advocating for rights, or are you just creating awareness? Is your struggle political, or is it just a little bit more toned down? And I think that those are the different things that I would ask myself. Obviously, there are security measures that you want to take as well, but I think that there's some good behavioral and sort of tone-related questions there that are also important to think about. It's not just how do I upload this blog and how do I protect my IP address, but it's also how do I protect myself from getting arrested if I choose to go online and identify myself in that environment. So that's what I would think about. But I would never say you should be anonymous, you shouldn't be anonymous, because I think that's a really personal choice, and one that I've watched friends struggle with both ways in the past. I think there was one more question, and then it looks like we should probably wrap up because the other folks are coming in. What was the last question?
I just wanted to say if you had any advice for people in the room to look online for good resources.
Excellent. I do. I've got so much advice. Okay, so if you want to learn more about all of these different things, I'm going to give you my organizations first, but then I'm going to give you a couple more too, just so you know that I've got all of your best interests at heart. So I work for an organization called the EFF, or the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and we have a resource. Right now it's only in 4 languages, and Italian's not one of them, but we can get there. And it's ssd.eff.org. So 9 letters. Again, it's ssd.eff.org. Another really good one is from the Tactical Technology Collective, Security in a Box. That's in a lot more languages, and it's a little bit more holistic in its approach. The one that we do is much more digital. Theirs is much more everything that you need to think about. And they've also got specific guides for specific circumstances, which is nice. There are some other ones out there, but in my opinion, those 2 are kind of the good places to start. You can also look at Freedom of the Press Foundation. They've got some good stuff that's specific to journalists, and I think they've been writing a little bit more lately as well. But with that, I'm going to stop here. You're welcome to email me if you have any questions later or want any of these materials, and thank you so much for coming.